Today we're going to be in part 2, Romans chapter 10. I called this a disobedient and contrary people, but the main question is, what about Israel? What about Israel? That's what people wonder today and all through history. How come they have been the source of so much hatred and anti-Semitism and really difficult occurrences happening for that nation? And Paul addressed this. The question is, has God failed Israel? They feel that they are His chosen people, His elect people, and yet when you look back historically, they feel that they've been neglected and not protected and not taken care of. And the question is that God's fault? Has God failed Israel? Has God done something wrong? So as we look at chapter 10 here, I want to remind us something first. Take you back to 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. And this should set the context for how we approach any of Paul's writings, any of Paul's letters, because Peter, his own contemporary, Peter, the guy that knew Paul, the guy that understood the language, the guy that understood the culture, the guy that knew the same Old Testament texts, Peter himself says, man, when Paul writes, there's some stuff that's hard to understand. So let's look at that. Verse 15. Consider also that our Lord's patience brings salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you with the wisdom that God gave him. He writes this way in all of his letters, speaking in them about such matters. Some parts of his letters are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, as they do the rest of Scriptures to their own destruction. So Paul is saying, even for that audience, knew the language, knew the culture, knew the background, even in that culture, there were people that were taking Paul's words and making them mean something that Paul never meant. And if it was easy to do that at the same time that Paul wrote the letters, imagine 2,000 years later, the kinds of things that people can assume Paul said that weren't really so. Again, I'll just remind you that what we're going to do, the way we're looking at the chapter and diagramming it, is trying to recognize the different rhetorical devices that Paul uses. And we learn to recognize which one of these things we can suspend temporarily, just so that we can focus in on what Paul's main theme is, Paul's main message here in chapter 10. So he uses parentheticals, little pieces of information that he likes to put in, but you don't need it to see his theme. He uses lots of examples. Katinas. Katinas are when Paul chains together a bunch of scriptural chains. The technical name for that is katinas. The anticipatory objections, Paul uses what's called the imaginary interlocutor, somebody that objects to what he's saying. So sometimes he'll write about that stuff, so on and so forth. Doxological praises. So momentarily we'll identify these and go, okay, that's what this is. It's not part of the main theme. Let's suspend this momentarily so that we can just identify the main theme of chapter 10. As we get into chapter 10, Paul is going to give us two, what I'm calling blue line backbones of his argument. Blue line because when you edit a book or you edit a report, you usually highlight the significant backbone sentences. And if you have 400-page report or a 400-page book, and you're an editor and you want to quickly make your way through the book, you highlight just the sentences that are your main dominoes, your main theological point, and everything in between there is fluff that you can suspend for a little while. So Paul gives us two in chapter 10, and we'll find them both. I'll lay them out for you. But first, when Paul opens chapter 10, Paul opens chapter 10 the same way he opened chapter 9. In chapter 10, verses 1 and 2 are just an emotional outburst, a little opening to his new thought that he brings up. So let's look at it, verses 1 and 2. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them, he means Israel, is that they may be saved. Because I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge. That last phrase, not according to knowledge, sort of begins his blue line backbone. You might even just put a little square around that or a little blue highlight there. So this is an emotional outburst. Paul wants to come back to his audience and says, hey, I love Israel. I am part of Israel. I want them to be saved. I desire that they would be included in God's salvific moment. I crave their salvation. And that's the same thing he said in chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. So he puts that out there because Paul might sound, when he explains to Israel what the problem is, he can almost sound anti-Semitic. That's a big deal today. You don't want to sound anti-Semitic or against Israel. But Paul is using the Old Testament scriptures to say, hey, Israel, we do have a concern about Israel. All throughout the Old Testament, we've seen the concern about Israel, that they have rejected God's commandments, rejected God's laws, and that has brought monumental, horrible consequences upon the nation of Israel historically. So Paul wants to remind them, I love Israel, I want them to be saved, my heart's desire, and I can testify that they do have a zeal for God. They do have a love for God, a compulsion to reach out for God. And then comes part of his blue line backbone, his main theme. But it's not according to Bible. It's not according to the text. It's not according to knowledge. One thing I want to note in recognizing that Paul says, hey, my prayer is that Israel will be saved. We kind of can tell from that Israel's fate is not already fixed. It's not already predetermined or predestined. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense for Paul to say, I'm praying for them, hoping that they will obey the gospel. The very nature of Paul being willing to do that means it's still within the realm of expectation that some of them might obey the gospel. Israel's trajectory hasn't already been settled in advance, but rather he's going to say Israel is failing because they're resisting the scriptures, not because it's already been decided or predestined that would happen. All right, we get into verse 3 and 4, and verses 3 and 4 are Paul's backbone, Paul's main theme of what he's trying to say in chapter 10. So this is important, verses 3 and 4. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end. Christ is the telos of the law for righteousness to all the believing, or to everyone who believes. Christ is the goal. Christ is the end point. Christ is where you end up. The Torah was there to lead us to Christ. So let me define a couple terms in this text, because some of this sounds cryptic to us. When he says, being ignorant of the righteousness of God, the righteousness of God, it might be easy for us to come to our own conclusion of what that meant, but what we want is to dig back and say, what was the Old Testament historical Jewish understanding of this concept of God's righteousness? And it turns out it's not really that God is a good person or a moral person. That's how we would interpret it. Israel's understanding of God's righteousness is the way that God would preserve his covenant with people. That's what the Jewish expectation of God's righteousness. God's righteousness is that he keeps his covenant. He tells you what He's going to do, and then He does exactly what He told you He would do. That's the God that we know. That's His righteousness, the God that reveals His will, tells us what He wants, and then does what He says He's going to do. But an important part of the covenant that God makes with Israel, all throughout Deuteronomy, covenant language with Israel is always full of blessing and curse. The curse is what often gets left out and forgotten when people talk about covenant relationship. The covenant, God always states, I lay before you the good and the bad. I lay before you life, and I lay before you death. Choose life that you may prosper. But if you reject my commandments and reject me and go worship other gods, there will be death and destructions. Frequently in the Old Testament, it says, all the curses written in this book will come upon you. And that is the righteousness of God, that He blesses Israel when they are obedient, and He brings curses on Israel when they reject Him and are disobedient. That's the whole Old Testament, guys. God's righteousness. So that's what righteousness, God's righteousness. Try to think of, when you see that, try to think of God doing what He promised He would do. And He says here, part of God's righteousness, part of God doing what He said He was going to do is, in verse 4, Christ, Messiah. Throughout the Old Testament, God promised a messianic figure. In Jeremiah, God also promised a new covenant. So this new covenant and the Christ, the Messiah, are both part of God's righteousness, something God said He would bring about, and in Paul's day had already happened, is what Paul is saying. When it says, for Christ is the end, the telos, let me kind of help define that concept a little bit. The end, the telos in the Bible, the easiest go-to translation of that should be the goal. The goal. Because to us, in our English, when somebody says that's the end, to us that means the termination point. The end. That's it. It's over. But telos in the Bible means the goal. The place where this was taking us to all along. The goal. Let me put a pin in the sermon right there and give you a little metaphor, analogy of this concept. If we were to refer to college and we would say, that's the end of college, most of us would think graduation day, senior year. That's the end. But that's not what telos says. The end would be more like, what is the end goal of college? What is the ultimate end of going to college? And that's a much bigger thing that you want to unpack. Well, the ultimate goal of college is to get an education, get a degree. I can develop a career, hopefully have a stable career and financial security and support my family. So you see the difference between the end, graduation day, senior year, and the telos. The telos is the ultimate goal of the big thing. And what he is saying is the telos of the Old Testament, the ultimate goal of the New Testament was to deliver a new covenant and a Messiah. Super valuable insights for us, guys. And Paul is saying, and the Messiah came. Let me kind of give you a scripture. In Romans chapter 1, Paul had already said that Jesus, the Messiah, was part of God's righteousness, part of God's promise, and now God is keeping that promise. Let me take you back to Romans chapter 1 and verse 15. And Paul says, I'm eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. The Jew first and also the Greek. Now here's our critical text, verse 17. Because in it, the righteousness of God is revealed. So if we go back to our text where he says they were ignorant of the righteousness of God, Paul defines that in chapter 1. He says the righteousness of God is revealed, made known in the gospel. What is the gospel? The good news of the Messiah, His life, His death, His resurrection. And Paul is saying that is God's righteousness. The gospel, Jesus, the Messiah, the death, burial, and resurrection is God's righteousness. That sounds very cryptic to us today. But he's saying that is what God promised us. God promised a new covenant. God promised a Messiah. Jesus is it. The gospel is God keeping His promise. But in our text today, Paul says the problem is not God keeping His promise. The problem is they did not submit to God's righteousness. Instead, they chose to establish their own. When God delivered, when God did what He said He would do, when God brought about the new covenant and the Messiah, it says they did not submit to that part of God's plan. Instead, they established their own way of righteousness. Very powerful. Okay, so that's the backbone. That's the main thesis. And now, verses 5 through 13 of Romans chapter 10 is all a katina. A katina is when Paul chains together a lot of scriptures to support what he just said. And it's great to recognize 5 through 13 as a katina, as a chain of scriptures, but for the moment you could suspend understanding that section and just recognize the purpose of this section is to support what he just said in verses 3 and 4. We're going to find out that this section, 5 through 13, gets a lot of varied interpretations. And a lot of churches have made the focus of Romans 10, they've made the focus verses 5 through 13. And they've missed Paul's actual theme, Paul's actual focus, which is verses 3 and 4. So I'm going to run through 5 through 13 and try to give you a little breakdown of it so you can have it broken down in your mind. But remember, this is the part where Paul supports his theme by using a chain of scriptures. I'll just quickly give them to you. He's going to give you about 3 or 4 different texts here. The first section is going to be verses 5 through 10. In verses 5 through 10, Paul is taking you back and quoting Deuteronomy chapter 29 and chapter 30. That is the most illuminating exegetical tool you can use. If you want to understand verses 5 through 10, you need to be familiar and you need to know Deuteronomy chapter 29 and chapter 30. Otherwise, you're going to invent, just like Peter said, because they twist the scripture, they make it mean something it doesn't really mean. So let's make a note of that in your text, Deuteronomy 29 and 30. Let me give you a brief overview of 29 and 30. This section is so critical, guys, that I'd like to go into depth with you. So after we get done with 9, 10, and 11, I'm going to come back to this text, and we'll do one sermon on just Romans 10, verses 5 through 10, and how it relates to Deuteronomy 29, 30. But just quickly, let me give you an overview. In 29 and 30, Israel has been rebellious. They've strayed away from God. And in 29 and 30, God is calling them back and wanting to reestablish His covenant relationship with Israel. And when He reestablishes His covenant with Israel, He says, I'm going to tell you what I want of you, and there'll be blessings and there'll be curses. Blessings if you do what I ask you to do, curses if you reject my commandments and worship other gods. And then He goes into this interesting section in 29 and 30, Deuteronomy, and He begins saying, what I'm about to tell you is not too hard for you. It's not up in heaven. What did He mean by that? It means it's not too lofty. It's not too difficult. And what He's talking about is His Torah, His command, His expectation of Jerusalem. It's not too hard. It's not across the sea, He says, meaning it's not so far away that it's impossible to do. My words, my covenant with you, basically Torah, is very, very doable. Now, what Paul does in Romans is he takes all of Deuteronomy 29 and 30, how it talks about Torah. It's not in the heavens that you can't have access to it. It's not across the ocean that you can't reach it. And he also says it's in your mouth and it's in your heart. What did he mean in Deuteronomy when he said that? Because with your mouth you recite the Torah, right? They always repeat it. And with your heart, you internalize Torah and you execute God's will. Your mouth and your heart. Paul borrows all that language, and turns it upside down, and he applies every one of those phrases, but he reworks it and applies it to Jesus. In Torah, when it said it's not up in heaven that you can't go get it, he says that means Jesus being in heaven. When it says it's not across the sea that you can't reach it, he says that means Jesus' resurrection. He says it's on your lips when you repeat Torah. But Paul says, no, it's on your lips if you confess Jesus as your Savior. So it's fascinating what Paul does with this piece of text. And if you don't know that he's reworking Deuteronomy 29 and 30, people will invent all kinds of interpretations for this. Let me just put a pin in the sermon right here and tell you about a concern of mine. It's typical for a lot of the Protestant denominations to use a gimmick called the Romans Road of salvation. The Romans Road, the Romans path of salvation. And they weave through Romans chapter 3, Romans chapter 5, Romans chapter 8, and then they end up here in Romans chapter 10, verses 5 through 10, and they say, you see, whoever believes with his heart and confesses with his mouth will be saved. And they use that as their conversion tool. Their moment of conversion is when you do what Romans chapter 10 tells you to do. And I'm going to come back to this and show you what it really means, but you can see that they've misused the text, not knowing that Paul is reworking Deuteronomy 29 and 30 to prove what he said in verses 3 and 4. That's enough about that, guys, but I'll come back to that and we'll do a sermon on that. That's 5 through 10. In this section also, in verses 11 through 12, Paul is quoting from Isaiah chapter 28. Isaiah chapter 28, the purpose is around verses 1 through 13 of Isaiah 28. Isaiah is warning Jerusalem not to make the same mistake that the northern tribes made, because God brought Assyria in to destroy the northern 10 tribes, blotted them out, wiped them off, exiled them all over the world, and they're never ever to be heard of again. And God explains in Isaiah 28 why He did that. Because when I sent my prophets to tell them my words, my Torah, my commands, They scoffed at the prophets. They mocked the prophets. They said God's commands are just instructions for little children, and for that reason, God says, I exiled them, obliterated them, destroyed them. So now in Isaiah 28, that was verses 1 through 13, he gives that case study, but he's talking to Jerusalem in that chapter. And to the Jewish people in Jerusalem, he says, learn the lesson, learn what happened to them so that the same thing doesn't happen to you. And that's when he introduces this phrase, whoever believes will be saved. He's already saying in 28, this is not going to be my righteousness, my covenant is not going to always be obedience to Torah. Someday it's going to be whoever, that means it includes Jews and Gentiles. Whoever, that's an important phrase, meaning all the world is included, believes in this rock, this foundation stone, this testing stone. God says, I'm going to set up a stone, Isaiah 28, and whoever believes in that stone is going to be saved. So there is an eschatologic promise, a prophecy of something happening in the future, and that's going to be how God saves Israel. Well, that is what Paul is quoting in verses 11 and 12, and he expects you to understand that story. Also in this section, another quote, another biblical chain that Paul refers to. In verse 13, Paul is referring to Joel chapter 2, verse 32. So Romans 10:13, Paul is quoting from Joel chapter 2, verse 32. That one, let's go ahead and read it, because I was going to give you a little bit of information about it. We'll go ahead and look at this one. Verse 13, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Again, that kind of sounds like what he showed them in Isaiah 28, similar phrase, whoever believes in the rock. Joel says the same thing. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord. I want to give you some insights into what Joel was saying there. When Joel says everyone, he's extending salvation beyond Israel, beyond just the Jews, saying anyone of any tribe, language, nation, tongue, everyone. That's an important eschatologic prophecy. In the future, God says, salvation is going to extend to everyone. And how is it going to come? Is it going to come through obedience to Torah? Obedience to Moses? No, he says in Joel, no, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Now, let me tell you what he's doing in Joel, and then I'll come back and tell you what Paul is doing here in verse 13. In Joel, the word Lord, in Joel 2, when it says everyone who calls on the name of the Lord, put a circle around Lord in Joel 2:32, because Lord in the Hebrew is actually the word Yahweh. That is a huge insight. For some reason, when the Jewish scholars who transcribed the Hebrew into Greek, they didn't want to say the Hebrew name Yahweh for God. So they began translating Yahweh as Kurios. Kurios is Lord. So in the Old Testament, when you see Lord, the actual Hebrew word right there is Yahweh. I'm sad that our Bibles don't have Yahweh. So Joel was saying whoever calls out to Yahweh will be saved. But when Paul uses it here in Romans 10:13, Paul is saying whoever calls out to Jesus will be saved. And that is a very important theological, Christological concept. Paul has said, where Joel told you to call out to Yahweh, Calling out to Yahweh now means calling out to Jesus. You can't help but see the Trinitarian nature of this. Jesus in Romans chapter 10 is the one that is called Kurios, the Lord, the one who saves. And that title was only reserved for Yahweh in the Old Testament. That's a very profound interaction there. So that's verse 13. He quoted Joel chapter 2. In verses 14 and 15 of our text today, chapter 10, verses 14 and 15, he's going to transition into more Bible verses, but he's going to create what we call the imaginary interlocutor. Romans 10, verses 14 and 15, Paul creates an imaginary interlocutor. Somebody in his audience that he is imagining is going to object to what he has said. And the objection is, well, what if they didn't hear about Jesus? What if they don't know about Jesus? Let me read it to you. Verse 14. How then will they call on him in whom they've not believed? How are they to believe in him whom they never heard? How are they to hear without someone preaching? How are they to preach unless they are sent? This is Paul imagining somebody objecting and saying that the reason Israel isn't accepting the Messiah is because maybe they haven't heard. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they're just ignorant of the message of the gospel. And then Paul says, they have heard. Every one of them did hear. And now he's going to start going in. That again, 14 and 15, the imaginary interlocutor, that's something you could suspend. You see how Paul gives a lot of information that's easily confusing to us, so you could suspend that. But let's go ahead and see what Paul's answer is for someone who says maybe they just haven't heard the gospel, maybe they're just ignorant about Jesus. Paul is going to answer that. And in verses 16 through 20 of Romans 10, 16 through 20 is another katina, another chain of scriptures that Paul has linked together. And we'll start with the first one. Verse 16, Paul is quoting Isaiah 53. And he expects you to know the whole chapter. So, Romans 10:16, Paul is quoting from Isaiah 53. Let's look at it. He says, but they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he's heard from us? Paul is suggesting that they know full well the gospel and they are just plainly rejecting it, ignoring it, dismissing it. And he says, because Jesus and Israel's rejection of Jesus was already prophesied about. And that's why he quotes Isaiah 53. So let me go back to Isaiah. Let me read Isaiah 53. Let me read some parts of it to you. And tell me if you don't see Jesus in this text. Isaiah 53, verse 1. Who has believed what he has heard from us? That's the line that Paul just quoted. And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Down to verse 3. He was despised and rejected by men. A man of sorrows, a man acquainted with grief. This is Isaiah looking into the future, seeing Israel's rejection of the Messiah. Verse 6, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've all turned, everyone to his own way. Pause right there. When he says we've all turned to our own way, isn't that what Paul just said? If we go back to our introduction, in our introduction, in verse 3, he says, because they were ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own righteousness. Isaiah prophesied that they would try to do things their own way. So, he says, everyone has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him, the Messiah, the iniquity of us all. Verse 7. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep before the shearers is silent, he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, he was stricken for the transgressions of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit found in his mouth. And you can go on and on and on. Paul says Israel heard the gospel. Israel knew about the Messiah, and Isaiah prophesied what they were going to do. They were all going to go their own way rather than listen to this man who is evidently killed and stricken for the sins of the very people that go their own way and rejected him. So Paul says, no, the suffering servant, Isaiah said that they would reject their suffering servant, and that's exactly what they're doing. They did know who he was. Israel misunderstood God's righteousness, God's eschatologic plan. They failed to recognize it. So they are culpable. Paul is saying, is God to blame for the things that happened to Israel? And Paul is answering that question, no, they are culpable because they failed to recognize God's righteousness, God's covenant, God promising to deliver a new covenant and a Messiah, and they failed to see it. You remember, this just came to me off the top of my head, but when Jesus was speaking to them, Jesus said something about you can look at the sky and know what the weather is going to be like. You know how to interpret the signs of the weather, but you don't know how to interpret the sign of the times. You don't realize Jesus is the Messiah, the eschatologic fulfillment of the Torah, God's righteousness, and you don't see it. They refuse to submit to it. So Paul is saying this is not a divine failure. This is not a failure on God's part. This is a failure to respond to what God brought about. Paul is in shock. He's asking, how can this be happening? How can God be reaching out to Israel, sending them prophets, telling them ahead of time that they're going to stumble on the stumbling stone, telling them ahead of time that it won't be your obedience to Torah that saves you, it will be your belief in the rock that God sends. It will always be about faith and belief. And Paul is going, how could they miss that? God stands there holding out his hands to Israel. But Israel would not respond. Another quote that he gives, verse 19 in our text, Romans 10:19. In verse 19, he gives them another quote from Moses. Romans 10, verse 20, he gives them another quote from Isaiah. Again, katinas. Quote upon quote upon quote. And you're expected to understand those Old Testament verses in order to interpret what Paul is trying to say. But finally, we come to verse 21. Verse 21 is important. Verse 21 is the close of Paul's argument in chapter 10. So you got Romans 10 verses 3 and 4 is the backbone, the blue line, the important theme. And then Romans 10 verse 21 is Paul's conclusion. The blue line, the backbone, an important theme. Here's the conclusion, verse 21. But of Israel he says, All day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. Does God want Israel to be saved? Has God made every effort to be saved? Is Paul interceding through prayer so that Israel can be saved? God and Paul and the Testaments are pro-Israel. We want them to be saved. But the conclusion, Paul says, all day long, God holds out His hands. But Israel, you are disobedient and contrary. It's not God's fault. God is not to blame. God reaches out. God is pro-Israel, but they refuse to submit to His righteousness, and instead they want to establish their own. Isaiah 53, all of them have gone their own way. And that's Paul's big conclusion in Romans chapter 10. Let me remind you something Jesus did. Jesus, Yahweh in the flesh, Matthew 23:37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those that are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing? That is Yahweh incarnate in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, looking out over His people, saying, I long to gather you. I long to bring you in. You weren't willing. That's the conclusion. Let me give you a little story that can relate like this. There's a teacher in a classroom, and a final is coming up, and this teacher is really invested in his students, really wants them to do well on their exams, on their finals. And so this teacher is absolutely invested in his students. He does everything in his power. He writes the lesson clearly on the board. He repeats the instructions over and over and over so everybody knows the instructions. He invites questions, clarity. Let me clarify. What can I clarify for you? And beyond that, the teacher is willing to stay after class. I'll stay after class and help you with your homework, help you work these things out. I'll stay after class. I'll even work through my lunch for you. If I can do something to help make this clearer, I'll stay after school and I'll work with you. I'll invest in you because I am invested in you. I want you to succeed. And he keeps opening his hands up. Does everybody understand? Is there anything I can help with? Do you need any help? Do you want me to explain something over again? What can I do? And yet there will be some students that just won't want what the teacher has to offer. They'll refuse any help and not care about whether or not they pass. And I think that that's kind of like what Romans chapter 10 is saying. Romans chapter 10 is revealing a God who has reached out, held open hands, done everything He could to communicate to Israel. But also in Romans chapter 10 is a group of people who refuse the help, who refuse to respond. Tragedy. Paul leaves it right there, and then we will pick up in Romans chapter 11 next week, guys.